In this video, I'm going to be going through a bunch of additional settings within your camera that we haven't covered yet. They're all very nuanced and very particular settings that might not be applicable to every situation, but they could be helpful if you have a very specific scene on your hands. So let's start from the top. Camera modes. So this is going to include automatic, aperture priority, and shutter. Generally, manual mode would be lumped into this category as well, but since we covered it so thoroughly in the exposure mode, I'm gonna leave it out for now. So let's start with automatic. So the complete opposite of manual would mean automatic mode. And this is where your camera essentially decides everything for you. It decides the focus point, the shutter speed, the ISO, the aperture. You literally don't have to do anything except click the button and it will take a photo for you. Since the control is so limited in this mode, I hardly ever used it. However, the one applicable moment where this might pop up is if someone happens to be taking a photo of you. So say you're hiking on a trail and someone offers to take a photo of you and your friends in front of some famous monument and you just want a basic snapshot. I hand my camera over in automatic mode, and then all a person has to do is hit the camera shutter button and boom, I have a photo. The next mode I wanted to go over is shutter priority. So this is similar to automatic mode, except now it allows you to adjust the shutter. So as we talked about in the exposure video, shutter is the amount of motion blur that your camera will intake. So you can set the shutter to 1/2000th of a second or 1 second, and everything else will be automatic within the camera and you don't have to do anything. The reason you might want to use shutter priority is if you're working with a scene that's moving very fast. So for example, if there's animals moving around, say you're at a zoo, or say you're at a bird sanctuary and you're trying to shoot birds, perhaps insects, or if you're at some kind of sporting event, or even just a social event where things are happening very fast, say there's people skateboarding by, and you know you want to capture a fast scene. So you could set your camera at 1/1000th of a second, and then no matter what, all you have to do is point it at the scene and everything else will be automatic. Therefore, you don't have to worry about adjusting your ISO and your aperture when a scene is happening right in front of you. So it's good for fast moving scenes. The next camera mode is aperture priority. And similar to shutter priority, this allows you to simply adjust the aperture. So the reason I would ever use this mode is for portraits, or if you're at events or perhaps at a concert. So say you know for a fact that you always want to have depth of focus, like you're always going to be shooting at 1.8 or 2.8 because you want that shallow depth of field to really emphasize the subject of a portrait shot. Then you can just set it on this mode and then walk around a party, walk around a portrait session, do whatever, and all you gotta do is point your camera and the depth of field will be covered and everything else will be automatic. So these two modes are great for very specific circumstances, but you know, for general landscape photography, they're not that applicable. So generally I work in manual mode if I'm going to be sitting with a particular landscape scene. So those are the camera modes I wanted to go over. The next section I wanted to cover is the drive modes. And drive modes are basically how fast your camera is taking photos. So a singular drive mode would essentially mean that your camera is going to take one shot when you hit the shutter button and stop. The second drive mode would be a continuous drive, and some people call this burst mode. So this essentially means if you hold the shutter down, it's going to keep clicking shots, basically like a machine gun, just brrrr. And depending on what type of camera model you have, this could be fast or slow, depending on how fast it's able to take those photos. And one thing to keep in mind is the buffer rate. So depending again on how good your camera is, you might be able to take, for example, 30 shots in a row, and then your camera has to load those 30 shots into the SD card before it can take more. So you really just have to find what the limit of your camera is to utilize burst mode to its full potential. Burst mode's great. Again, for sports, moving events, moving animals, birds, insects, anything that's moving fast and you want to have a variety of shots to pick through, just keep in mind that it's going to take a long time to sort through those photos and to upload them, especially if you're shooting at a high megabyte. So I'd be very careful about what scenes you're actually doing it on and not just free firing, or you could end up with literally thousands of shots to sort through, which can take a long time. So the next drive mode I want to go over is called bracketing. And bracketing is essentially an easy way to do exposure blends in your camera. So as we talked about in the exposure video, an exposure blend is, say you want the sky at one exposure and the landscape at another, and then you take two shots to blend them together in Photoshop. Bracketing will allow you to do this automatically. So you can set it up so that it will take 5 shots total, for example. And you could say, I want 2 shots to be of a brighter exposure than what I'm currently at, and 2 shots to be at a lower exposure than what I'm currently at, and then 1 shot to be the exposure that I'm currently at. And then you click the button and it'll go ahead and take all of those shots for you. And now you have 5 shots of the exact same scene at 5 different exposures. So now you can go through in Photoshop and blend those together very easily based off which ones are at the correct dynamic range that you want. So it's essentially an easy way to do exposure blending, and there's a variety of different settings that you could input in order to determine how much higher you want the exposure to go with each shot, or how much lower you want it to go, and also how many shots you take in total. So the last drive mode that I wanted to go over is timer. And most cameras have a 0, a 3, a 5, and a 10-second timer. So you can essentially hit this if you want to give yourself a little delay before the camera takes a photo. So from the moment you hit the shutter button, say you have it on a 3-second timer, it's going to count 3 seconds, then it's going to take the photo. So this is good mainly if you don't want to shake the camera if you're doing a long exposure. So for example, if you're going to do a 3-second exposure, instead of clicking the shutter button and then releasing it, which might make your camera jitter a bit and then add some motion blur into a shot, you can set it on a 3-second timer beforehand, click it, and then wait for the camera to settle, and then it'll take the shot when the camera is perfectly balanced and ready to go. It's also great for self-portraits. So if you want it to take a shot of yourself and you want to go run in whatever scene you're in and then take a photo, you can do that usually up to 10 seconds. If you want to have a shot that's more than 10 seconds, generally you have to either put your camera in a time-lapse mode if it has one, or get an intervalometer, which we talked about in the accessories section of this course. A few more settings I wanted to go over is image stabilization. So this will essentially allow you to take shots that are handheld and make them a bit more stabilized. So if you're shooting at something like 1/20th of a second, or even 1/10th or 1/30th of a second, and you're doing it handheld, usually this would have a bit of motion blur unless you have a perfectly steady hand. So basically, this image stabilization mode, if paired correctly with your lens that has an image stabilization mode, will eliminate that shake in it. So it's a way to compensate for that and make that a little easier. So I'd keep this on if you're doing handheld shots at those lower exposure settings that could be a little iffy. One very important thing to note with this setting is sometimes it can affect your camera if it's on a tripod. So if your camera's just sitting on a tripod and you take a long exposure and you're still getting motion blur in your shot for some reason and you can't tell why, image stabilization on can mess with this. Ironically, because image stabilization is supposed to make the camera stop shaking. But if you keep it on when you're on a tripod, then it can actually add motion blur to it. Don't ask me why, but it's one of the most common mistakes about when people can't figure out why they're getting motion blur when they're on a tripod. So turn it off if you're on a tripod. Another setting I wanted to go over is silent shooting and the beeps. So some cameras will have a beep, beep, beep before it takes the shot. There's ways to turn this off in your menu. Along with some cameras, you can turn off the shutter so you won't hear the click. This is good if you're at events where things have to be quiet and you don't want to disturb something, or perhaps if you're in nature and you don't want to scare a bird off or a bug or whatever, you can turn this off, which can be helpful. I also find it's good if you're shooting with other photographers around you. Another setting that I want to go over is creative styles. So this is essentially, not every camera has this, but some cameras will have settings within the modes where you can be like old-fashioned style, or futuristic style, or desaturated style, and it'll essentially apply a filter within the camera to a shot. I wouldn't recommend using these. They're just gonna mess up your image, and honestly, if you're shooting raw anyways, you can go through in Photoshop and do these edits plus more. So I like starting with a blank slate when I take photos instead of ingraining whatever settings that my camera thinks is good right off the bat. So don't ever use these. These are mainly just for people who are just starting off in photography and they really don't know what they're doing in the editing room. So avoid creative styles. They might be worded something different in your camera, but the main point is don't use them. Another setting that I want to go over is customization. So some cameras allow you to customize certain buttons on your camera to make things faster. And I would highly recommend setting these up if you have the option. So for example, I have a button on the back of my camera that I programmed that will essentially make it a 5-star rating on a certain photo. So today I take a photo, I really like it. it will go into the metadata of the photo and add it as 5 stars. That way, when I go into Lightroom later, I could recognize the photos and sort all the ones that were 5 stars. This allows me to remember which photos that I really liked in the field and which ones I'm gonna edit and really want to edit for that matter. So those are all the settings that I wanted to cover. Not that many. I'm sure there's a few other ones out there that you might find entertaining or useful, but everything I've covered in this course is everything you're most likely going to encounter in the first 5 years of your photography career. So, you know, if you encounter something else, just Google it real fast. It's not that hard, but all the important stuff is here. So let's go ahead and hop into the next video.